As we continue along our steps of decision making, we go back to our original 5 steps. We have talked about goals and resources. We've looked at alternatives. We've looked at advantages and disadvantages of alternatives. In this section, we're going to talk about what selecting an alternative is, this decision making itself, which is the choice. So choice by definition is the alternative selected. These are our objectives for our lesson on this. And we're going to really focus on Helga's decision. A great illustration. This story, by the way, is appropriate for many ages. It's a wonderful story. I hope you enjoy listening to it. And Helga is quite an interesting troll. There's a little bit of magic. It's a little bit silly. It's also a little bit realistic, and you can relate to it. And I think you'll really enjoy this. But I want you to focus, after you've listened to it once, on Helga's decision, on how she makes her decisions using that process we've been talking about. So Helga has a decision to make, and ultimately she has to make a choice from alternatives. So she has a goal. She sets out to achieve that goal, and these are just some pictures you'll see in the PowerPoint related to the story. She sets out to achieve that goal, and she encounters an obstacle. And because we've been talking to our students about obstacles and what they are and how we recognize alternatives when we find an obstacle, Helga exercises her alternatives, and she sees advantages and disadvantages of each alternative. So she makes a decision, and she chooses, right? So this is at the very beginning, and she chooses handsome Lars. And then she makes a different choice. When an obstacle is presented with handsome Lars, he instead decides that he will marry plain Inga because she has a dowry and Helga doesn't have one. So Helga then makes a different decision, and she says, well then, I'm going to go out and earn my own dowry. And some of the advantages of her decision to go out and earn her own dowry are that she's able to get even more together than she would have been, or than Inga's dowry ended up being, I should say. And so she did very well. So her choice yielded her a greater amount of property than Inga's dowry. You can see all that. And then there's another advantage of Helga's choice. And so as you're reading the story, this doesn't really do it justice. So I want you to listen to the story and think about this. Where are the alternatives? Where are the advantages and disadvantages of alternatives? And then what does Helga select? Right, so she has different alternatives, and there are advantages. Now, here's one advantage of her choice, is that here's handsome Lars, and she tells him, hey, hit the road, Jack, I'm done with you. Because she's earned her own dowry, he comes running back to her and says, oh, I love you more than ever. And she says, nope, I can do without. And then in the end of the story, I don't want to give too much away because it's such a great story, but she makes a different decision. After all of her obstacles and alternatives and decision making, her ultimate decision is made, and there's an advantage to her choice at the end. So you can ask your students to identify the decision making in Helga's story. In the beginning, what was her goal? What obstacle did she face in the very beginning? Clearly the lack of a dowry was going to be her obstacle. What alternatives did she have? And which one did she select from her alternatives? Then once she did select the one that was going to be to go out and earn her own dowry, what resources did she have? And what alternative ways did she have to accomplish that goal? So there's lots of great stuff in this story to have your students identify the different aspects of decision making. Did her goal change throughout the story? And clearly the answer to that is yes, but you want your students to be able to see how it changed, and how did Helga herself change throughout the story. So I want you to enjoy this story. Maybe listen to it more than once, and be willing to share it with your students in repetition. Students enjoy a repetition. You might know this already about children, especially the younger children. They love a story told again and again and again. So don't be afraid to repeat a story in order to have a greater understanding of the concepts. Another story that we can use to illustrate the idea of choice is Ferdinand the Bull. And this is a wonderful story. It's simple, but he has alternatives. So Ferdinand has a goal, he has an obstacle, he has alternatives, and he has advantages and disadvantages of the various alternatives, and he makes his choice from those alternatives. So Ferdinand ultimately has the ability, or the alternatives rather, to play with his friends or to sit and smell the flowers. And his decision is, he weighs the costs or the advantages and disadvantages of the alternatives, and his choice is to sit and smell the flowers. However, obstacle occurs because as an adult, in come the people that are selecting bulls for the bullfights, and an incident takes place where he sits on a bee, and he appears to be very vicious and all the things that they really want in a bull. He's very big and strong, and so they select him for the bullfight. And again, when given the alternatives, his choice is to sit quietly under the tree. It doesn't really change, but that's taken from him, and he continues to make choices. So I want you to listen to that story. Also, if you get a chance, there's a movie based on that, an animated film, and it is fantastic. And it's pretty faithful to the original story, but a much cuter version. It's really a sweet movie. Minna's decision, we can go back to the rag coat to again identify the decisions made by Minna in the face of obstacles and alternatives and advantages and disadvantages. She makes a decision in her story as well, particularly the one where she goes to school and then she leaves school and is deciding what to do after she's sitting on the log and she's trying to decide what her next course of action should be. And so you can talk to your students about Minna's decision and what the alternatives were, and then what her choice was to return to school and face the students. So how does an alternative become a choice? And it is by that process of selecting the alternative, which again sounds really basic to us as adults, but this is what we want to really impart to our students. The power of decision making, taking alternatives, weighing them, looking at advantages and disadvantages, weighing them against each other, and selecting the one that, from our perspective, or from the character's perspective in these stories, is going to most likely achieve that goal. It doesn't mean that all decisions are made perfectly and with perfect foresight. In fact, all we can do is look to the future when decision making and anticipate the outcomes. And certainly we know that the outcomes aren't always what we expect, but as we're teaching our students about decision making, we want them to know that alternatives become a choice when that alternative is selected. So now we are at the last stage of our decision-making process, and we'll follow up with our look at opportunity cost.